Hey everyone, it's Jessica Coulter. Today we're going to be talking about two-step equations. So hopefully you watched my video on one-step equations and you're ready for the next step. So if you have any questions before we get started, I would highly recommend going to my one-step equation video, and the link is here on the screen for you. And it's Jessica Coulter here with you today, and just for those of you who are wondering, I'm the CEO and founder of Ace Cookie Tutoring, and I've helped a lot of students just like you and maybe your own kiddos with math. So I'd love to help you get an A in your class, and I look forward to teaching you everything you ever want to know about two-step equations. Before we get started, just want to go over a couple of reminders that I think are really important for you to understand how to do two-step equations. The first is that term inverse. So that's something we talked about in that one-step equation video. And for those of you that don't remember, inverse just means opposite. So we need to remember that multiplication and division are opposites, and addition and subtraction are opposites. So that's really important when we're trying to get the variable by itself. So that's a second reminder, and I hope that's something you picked up after the last video. The whole purpose of both one-step equations and two-step equations is to get the variable by itself. So we're solving for a variable, and we're trying to figure out what its value is. And again, in case you need it, I have the link for the one-step equation video on the screen. Highly encourage you to watch that if you had any trouble at all with the one-step equations before moving on to two-step equations. Okay, now that we have those reminders out of the way, we are ready for example number 1. So our first problem is 2x plus 4 equals 12. Okay, so one-step equations, we knew we had to get the variable by itself and move everything to the opposite side of the equal sign. So it's the same thing here, except we have two steps instead of one step. So our first step here is to get rid of the plus 4. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to subtract 4 from both sides, because remember, the opposite of addition is subtraction. So for my first step, which is going to be in green on the next slide, I'm going to have 2x plus 4, and then I'm going to subtract 4 from the left side of the equal sign and subtract 4 from the right side of the equal sign. So once I do that, I now have 2x equals 8. So I have done one step. Now you have to ask yourself, are we done? Now if the x is by itself, then yes, we would be done. But the x is still attached to that 2 by multiplication, so we're not done. So this is when the second step comes into play. I have to get that 2 separated from the x by dividing, because the opposite of multiplication is division. So on the next screen, we'll have a purple step, and that is going to be the second step. So that's how we get our two-step equation name. So I'm going to do 2x divided by 2, and then I'm going to divide 2 into 8 on the right side of the equal sign. And my final answer is x equals 4. Now if you want to see everything all together for example number 1, that's on this screen. So we've got 2x plus 4 equals 12. That was my problem. And then we have the green. We subtracted 4 from both sides. And then you can see the purple, which was step 2. We divided both sides by 2. So my final answer is 4. I just wanted to show it to you in two different ways, so that way you had a couple of different ways to learn how to do this problem. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to example number 2. So before we go to example number 2, just want to take a moment and let anyone know who is looking for some one-on-one help that we are available for in-person lessons as well as lessons online through Zoom. You can do that by scheduling a lesson at acecookie.com/book online. So just follow the link on your screen. For some people, I know math can be really difficult, and sometimes it's just easier to have someone there next to you kind of holding your hand and walking you step by step. So if that would work better for you or for your student, we would love to work with you. And again, just go to that link on your screen, which is acecookietutoring.com/book online. Okay, let's go ahead and get back to example 2. Okay, let's move on to example number 2. Now this one's a little harder than the last example because it has negative numbers. So here's example number 2. 4 minus 7x equals negative 66. So first step, we have to decide how to get the variable and its term on the same side of the equal sign without anything else on the same side. So I've got 4 and then I have 7x on the left side of the equal sign with that minus sign, and on the right side of the equal sign I've got negative 66. So my first step is going to be minus 4 on both sides. Now this can be a little tricky for some of my students because they see that minus sign and don't know which term it goes to. So what I always tell people, and if you're struggling with this, is look to the left. So to the left of the 4 is an invisible positive sign. So if there's no sign to the left of a number, that means it's positive. So I look to that 7x, and to the left of it is the minus sign. So I hope that makes sense. So I'll say it one more time. The 4 is positive because the minus sign between the 4 and the 7x goes to the 7x, not the 4. Okay, so we're going to take away 4 from both sides, which leaves me with negative 7x equals negative 70. Now, depending on your teacher and his or her requirements, you might need to break out a number line or a calculator to do that math. I know other students, especially younger kids or ones really new to negative numbers, struggle with subtracting negative numbers. The way I always teach it is that you're getting more negative. Or maybe think of it as you owed someone $66 and then you asked for 4 more, so you owe them even more money. So let's move on to step number 2. Step number 2 is going to be in purple again, so I'm going to do that throughout the whole presentation. Green is going to be step 1, purple is going to be step 2. So I've got to get the x by itself. It's attached to that negative 7, so I'm going to divide each side by negative 7, which gives me my answer of x equals 10. And again, if you struggle with dividing negative numbers, then there might be either you need to get a calculator, or you need to remember when I divide a negative by a negative, it gives me a positive. Okay, so negative divided by negative gives me a positive. Now on this screen, we have everything all together. So I have the green for minus 4 on both sides, and then I've got the purple of minus 7. So I'm dividing by negative 7 on both sides to give me that answer of x equals 10. Okay, let's go to number 3, example number 3. It is 6x minus 10 equals 8. So this one's going to be a little easier than example 2 because it doesn't have as many negative numbers. So just remember what we talked about. We're going to look to the left to determine if that's a negative 6x or a negative 10. So I hope you're ready. Let's look at step number 1. I'm going to add 10 to both sides. And do you remember why? Is that 10 negative or is it positive? And it is negative because that minus sign is to the left of the 10. So step 1 is in green, and I'm subtracting 10 from both sides, which gives me 6x equals 18. And as you're hopefully seeing by now, step 2 is normally, or it's not very uncommon, for it to be to divide. So step 2 in purple is to divide by 6 on both sides, which gives me the final answer of x equals 3. So on this screen again, we got everything together in case that's easier for you. You've got the original problem, 6x minus 10 equals 8. And then you've got the green, which is step 1, and then you've got purple, which is step 2. So let's go ahead and move on to the next example. Well, we hope you are enjoying this video and learning a lot about two-step equations. If you are looking for some more videos like this, maybe some more tutorials about English or science or some other subject you struggle with, just go to that link on your screen, acecookietutoring.com/tutorial. We would love to give you some free homework help and help you out as much as we can. If you have any questions about this video, or maybe there's a specific two-step problem you're working on that we didn't cover, just go ahead and leave that in the comments for us, and we'd love to add to the video. So thanks so much, and we'll get back to the next example. Alrighty, let's move on to example number 4. Now this one might look a little scary because it has a fraction and a decimal. Example 4 is x divided by 2 plus 3.5 equals 21. So I have a lot of students who would freak out as soon as they see that division sign, let alone the decimal. But I promise we're going to do this problem just like all the other two-step equations. Now there is a special way to handle division when it comes to fractions, so we'll get to that in step number 2. So step 1 is pretty easy. I've got that positive 3.5. So to move it to the other side and to get rid of it, I have to subtract both sides by 3.5. So that's hopefully pretty easy by now. So after I subtract 3.5 from both sides, I'm left with x over 2 equals 17.5. So this is where it gets a little tricky for some students. In order to get rid of the division sign, I have to remember the opposite of division. And the opposite of division is multiplication. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 in order to cancel out divided by 2. So that leaves me with x equals 35. Now it might make a little bit more sense on this screen with the color coding and with the parentheses around the x over 2. So remember the original problem, x divided by 2 plus 3.5 equals 21. So we've got the green, which is step 1. We're going to subtract both sides by 3.5. And then I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 in order to get the x by itself. And remember, when I have a parentheses and then a number right next to the parentheses, that means multiplication. So that is example number 4. If you struggle with that one, I might take a quick break and go back and re-listen to the previous slide and rework the problem on your own. Alrighty, I hope you have those examples down, because this next example is probably the hardest one in the whole presentation. I'm going to consider it the challenge example. So depending on your age or the grade level of your student, they might or might not be ready for this example, your kiddos. So it is going to involve the distributive property, and our example here is 4 times x plus 6 equals 296. So I'm going to go ahead and do this one in a couple different steps just in case you're not familiar with the distributive property. So what's important to remember here is that everything inside of the parentheses, so the x plus 6, is being multiplied by the 4, which is outside of the parentheses. So if you look over on the right of the screen, you'll see those red lines. So those red lines are pointing from the 4 to the x and from the 4 to the 6. So what that means is I'm going to do 4 times x, and then I'm going to do 4 times 6. So essentially I have to distribute the 4 to everything inside of the parentheses. And remember, a number right next to parentheses without anything in between the number and the parentheses means multiplication. So once I do that, I've got 4 times x and then 4 times 6. I'm left with 4x plus 24 equals 296. So again, if you struggled with that, just take a moment to figure that out before you go ahead and go on to actually solving this problem. Because at this point, it looks just like a two-step equation that we've done in our other examples. So I'll say it one more time. We're distributing the 4 to the x and to the 6. And after I multiply 4 by x and 4 by 6, then I keep track of those signs. So the x is positive and the 6 is positive. So I'm adding them together and I have a problem now I can solve. So let's go ahead and go to the next step and actually do the 2 steps we would do for our 2-step equation, because this is an extra step your student might or might not be seeing depending on his or her grade level. So here we are back with our challenge example. So we left it at 4x plus 24 equals 296. So this is what we came up with after doing the distributive property in the previous slide. So if you're confused how we got here, I'd highly recommend rewinding the video a little bit and figuring out where these numbers came from. So we're going to do our step 1, which is to subtract 24 from both sides, which leaves us with 4x equals 272. And again, just like we've been doing, the x is not by itself, so we have to do another step to separate the x and the 4. And I'm going to do division because the x is attached to the 4 by multiplication. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4, and I end up with x equals 68. So this slide just has everything not including the distributive property. So it's got step 1 in green, the subtracting 24 from both sides, and then it has purple, which is step 2, dividing 4 from both sides. So I get x equals 68. Before we move on to the last slide where we double check our answer, just wanted to let anyone know who is interested in keeping up to date with us that we are on Facebook. So if you'd like to follow us and keep up to date with all the study tips that we post daily, the free resources, as well as what Ace Cookie Tutoring is up to, we'd love to have you follow us by going to that link on your screen. It's www.facebook.com/Ace Cookie Tutoring. So this slide and the next couple are going to show you how to double check your answers. So I would highly recommend looking at these slides if you struggled with any of the examples. So all we're going to do is we're going to plug in the value we found for x into the original equation. So for example number 1, we started with 2x plus 4 equals 12. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in 4 since that's the value we found for x. And I'm going to end up with 2 times 4 plus 4. And when I simplify that, I get 12 equals 12. So as long as the number on the left is equal to the number on the right, then I know my answer is correct. So example number 2, I started with 4 minus 7x equals negative 66. And I found x to be 10. So again, I'm going to plug in 10 for x. And I'm going to end up with 4 minus 7 times 10, and we're going to see if that's equal to negative 66. So following the order of operations, I have to do 7 times 10, and we're going to keep that minus sign there, remember. So the minus sign goes with the x in the 7 term because of the fact it's to the left of the 7. So I'm going to have 4 minus 70 equals negative 66. And I simplify and I get negative 66 equals negative 66. So it looks like we did examples number 1 and 2 correctly. On this slide we double check examples 3 and 4. So example 3 we had 6x minus 10 equals 8 and we found x to be 3. So I have 6 times 3 minus 10 equals 8. And I simplify that and get 8 equals 8. And then for example 4, I have x over 2 plus 3.5 equals 21, and we found x to be 35. So I recommend you be careful with this one because it's a little more complicated than the first 3 examples. So I plug in 35 for x, divide it by 2, and then I'm going to add 3.5. So when I do 35 divided by 2, I get 17.5. And when I add the 3.5 to the 17.5, I get 21. So again, if you get the same number on the left side as on the right side, that means you did it right. If you get a different number, I highly suggest that you go back and double check your math. A lot of the times for me, when I get the wrong answer, it's just because I rushed something or I wrote down a number incorrectly. Alright, here is the challenge problem. It's the last example. We need to double check and make sure we did correctly. So the challenge problem was 4 times x plus 6 equals 296. And we found x to be 68. So now remember, on this problem we use the distributive property. So in order to check our answer, we have to use the distributive property again. So I plug in 68 for x, and now I have 4 times 68 plus 6 equals 296. So just like on the previous example, I have to use the order of operations, and I need to make sure I distribute the 4. So I'm going to do 4 times 68, and I'm going to do 4 times 6. And once I find 4 times 68 to be 272, and then I find 4 times 6 to be 24, I'm going to add those together because there's that plus sign, so I know the 6 inside the parentheses is positive. And when I add 272 and 24 together, I get 296. So my answer is correct. Well, that is everything I have for you. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned a lot about two-step equations. If you still think you could use some one-on-one help, we would love to work with you. Feel free to go to that link in the first bullet, acecookietutoring.com/book online. You can book a lesson in person if you'd like, or you can book a lesson online through Zoom. And also do know we create resources, free ones like this, for tutorials via video, and we do also create paid resources. So if you would like some extra practice, we have different activities and worksheets we've created, and we'd love to work with you on those. And that link is acecookietutoring.com/shop. And finally, we do have an email list. So if you'd like to get our monthly newsletter and find out what our monthly special is going to be, we would love to have you join that list. Just send an email to the email address in the third bullet, acecookietutoring@gmail.com. Well, thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to talking to you in the next video.